Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Today, we're going to engage with a dear African-American brother who is being used by God to stir his own church and beyond when it comes to being globally minded. Our guest today is Christian Mungai, a native Kenyan who now serves as the Global Engagement Pastor at Mariners Church in Irvine, California. Together with his wife, Delta, Christian is passionate about deploying the church into what God is doing around the world. Before he served at this church in the United States, he was the member of an urban gospel and humanitarian singing group, Malele. That sounds like an interesting part of your career, Pastor Christian.
Yes, it is.
We could get a little sample of the African music during our podcast maybe today. That'd be.
You probably could. It's online. You can find it on Spotify.
Okay, very good. Yeah. It's Malele, Milele, in case you want to go check that out. Now, Christian has served in the United States for over a decade now, and he and his wife, Delta, have one daughter. Pastor Christian, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Megs.
Well, looking forward to this conversation with you, and let's begin with a bit of an introduction. Tell us just a bit about your mission journey, please, and how you came to be the Global Engagement Pastor at Mariners.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a privilege. I really appreciate even the time and the posture of learning that we're taking in this. I'm born and raised in Kenya in a ghetto to a Christian family. My dad was a Presbyterian tent maker, but raised us in the ghetto really difficult. Through that, I went through my wayward years, and I had a defining moment when I was 17. I was facing a 7-year jail term, and at that time, I rededicated my life to God, and since then took a different trajectory, and that's a story for another day. And then my dad was a stickler for education, so he was insistent that I use my mouth, that I ran a lot. He told me I need to go to law school and become a lawyer, which was contrary to what I believed. I wanted to be an actor and to be actually a soccer player and an actor. But he sent me to India, got my education, had a law degree out of there, got an opportunity to come to the US, purporting that I can come and still pursue my law. Back of my mind thinking I'm going to become an actor. That quickly did not happen. I realized that when the movie industry was a little rigorous and a little too intense for me. So it's while during that time I was struggling to find my identity that I was divinely reconnected with 3 of my childhood buddies from Kenya. We just started hanging out. The 3 of them had a love for music, so they decided to start leading worship for the little fellowship. I joined them as their hype man and a noisemaker. It was through that we decided that the world does not need another music group. But we're living in such a sight and sound generation that people do not really hear or understand until they can really experience it. So we started using music as a Trojan horse to help people experience the best of what was offered in Africa. We became a nonprofit, and so we would address systemic issues versus symptoms with regard to missions. And that's what I did for many years until Mariners Church came calling and they asked if I could come and join their staff, to which I said no. But after a deep relationship with one of their pastors, I decided to give them 10 hours, and 10 hours turned to be 12 years. And so I've been here 12 years now. And so that's a little bit of my journey, a snippet of it.
Praise the Lord. Thank you. Well, we want to talk about being globally minded today and how churches can become globally minded. Many of those listening to this podcast do serve or worship in a local church somewhere. Most of our listeners are in North America, and they're familiar with these ideas of being global minded. But let's just begin with that definition. What does it mean for a church, a local church, to be globally minded?
Yeah, first of all, I'd applaud the people who are listening to the podcast because it's part of it. I think one of the first things I'll say, to be globally minded is to take a posture of learning and listening from a perspective that is not yours. I think we have, most of us grew up in a singular minded perspective. To be globally minded just means you're taking a posture of listening and learning watching for the sign of the times. There's a scripture in First Chronicles that I love about the sons of Issachar who they knew the times and knew what to do. Being able to understand what's going on in the world, especially entering a new context, that's a wonderful way of being globally minded. Another aspect of being globally minded is a commitment to long-term relationships that revolutionizes how you live, how you think, and changes your perspective. One is posture. Two is a commitment to long-term relationships. Another one is what I'd call partnerships, and we're going to talk later about that. Those three things kind of, for me, encapsulate the heart of what it means to be globally minded.
Well, that's a great introduction. Learning and listening to a new perspective, committed to long-term relationships and partnerships. A great introduction. What are some of the global trends that can help inform us as we want to become globally minded?
Yeah, there's quite a number. And maybe today I'll just kind of talk about three. The first one is I'd say the evolution of missions. And this trend is one that comes with a lot of respect and honor for the missions efforts that especially the Western world has put into the global South. It's because of Western missionaries that the gospel got to my grandfather through a Scottish missionary who came. He made his way to my grandfather's village. And my grandfather was so taken aback by what they had to share. And so he became a chef for the missionaries. But he also raised his 12 kids in accordance to the word of God. One of his sons became a pastor in Kenya. So missionaries have done a great job, but I don't think sometimes they understand that they did. It's because of that now we have people like my grandfather, you've got people like my dad, and then you have me, who's now a missionary to North America. So missions has come full circle. So the evolution of missions is the first major change that has happened. And it's incredible to see how now in the turn of the 19th century, you had the global Christianity was mostly in the north. And so 2/3 were in the northern hemisphere. And that has shifted exactly the opposite. Now 2/3 of the Christian world is in the 2/3 world. So you've seen that shift, evolution of missions, which then behooves us to rethink how we are engaging in our missions models. And so that's been a big shift. The evolution of missions and the great work of the missionaries is one to be lauded, one to be affirmed, one to be grateful for, because we, people like myself and many others around the world, are a result of this direct sacrificial endeavors of the missionaries. So really grateful for that.
What I hear you saying is we can look back with thanksgiving at legacy and at faithfulness, and we want to build forward while we keep learning. We can't continue to use the same models that were faithful models in the past, but we need to keep learning. Innovating is maybe a word that fits here as well. It's both and, though.
Yeah, absolutely. But gratitude is a predominant posture. Is so grateful for the work of the missionaries, who some of them went to places like Africa or some parts of Asia on a one-way. They knew that they're taking their coffins because they knew they would never come back. We stand on their legacy and their backs.
Yeah, thank you, Lord, for those great examples. So now we have this evolution of missions, and if we agree that we need to evolve, we need to keep learning forward, what are the implications of this for us?
I'll mention a couple. The first one is understanding that now missions is no longer from the West to the rest, but from everyone to everywhere. So the West to the rest model is a little outdated, and we have to understand that missions is now from everyone to everywhere. And then the second one is understanding that the Great Commission is exactly that. It's a co-mission. And I, as a Kenyan, looking at the Great Commission, realize that my Jerusalem is Nairobi. My Judea and Samaria are probably within my continent, but my ends of the earth is exactly where I am today. So as I read the Great Commission from my context, it behooves me then to be in my ends of the earth, which is North America. But the North American church does not see itself as an ends of the earth because it thinks we're the center of the world. So If we rethink some of those things, it will help us understand that these are the implications, that we can no longer just do missions from the West to the rest. It's from everyone to everywhere. And then there's this beauty of understanding and engaging a core mission. The Great Commission is a great core mission that I have a responsibility based on the Great Commission to the church in North America and vice versa. And so being able to engage that from a mutual platform, from a place of collective decision making, from a posture of learning, giving and receiving is an implication of the evolution of missions. Does that make sense?
It sure does. And I appreciate the idea that we're also from the West, and I'm speaking as a Westerner. I think that it will require of us a type of humility to relearn and to take a new role. In fact, in some ways, we see the church in the West in some places a type of decline, but the Lord is at work boldly in other parts of the world. I guess it's just finding a new place in the conversation. It's not that the role of the Western church is finished.
No.
We're not handing the baton off and saying, you take it now, we'll sit down and have a rest. But it's a together thing. And you did say that this is really a co-mission.
It's a co-mission. In the past, we've had this very unhealthy 2/3 world dependence on the West. And then you've had this Western independence. But then we're calling for a better picture of interdependence. So you don't have the dependence of the Africans or the independence of the Americans or the Westerners. It's this beautiful picture of interdependence. And the scripture I'd like to cite there would be from 1 Corinthians 12 about the body. The hand cannot say to the foot, I do not need you. The body is interdependent. So that independence is that ability to engage from every perspective and not abdicating our role, but being able to engage interdependently.
Well, I really appreciate the tone of this discussion. And I'll just say this too, as I think about the missions movement, that doesn't mean that Westerners necessarily need to be the leaders either. I've some beautiful examples of where brothers and sisters from the global South have risen to leadership as well. That also requires a changing mindset for us from the West.
It does. And it takes a lot of humility too to do that.
And there are some organizations that have really done a fine job of this, I think. Not perfectly, but I think of Steve Richardson as an example in Pioneers, where he told me in his story, he made a deliberate decision that no longer would his organization, as the U.S. element of a multinational organization, no longer would they be the key leader, but they would take an equal role at a round table, as it were, welcoming sisters and brothers from around the world. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
A way to go, Steve.
That's a beautiful posture.
Now, that's an organizational level. I'd like to talk about this from a local church point of view. What do some of these implications mean for a missions committee, perhaps a pastor serving in a local church?
Yeah, with the understanding of this paradigm shift, then it calls for us to, as we take a posture of learning, it means inviting people from the global South to come and sit at the table, and not just a number, but a voice, just to invite other people to come and be a voice and have them speak into the missions models that are now being explored. If we're going to be interdependent, then that calls for us to finding global partners. And when we're finding partners, how we find partners is such a big thing. So for missions team, I'd encourage them, identify mission partners from around the 2/3 world, which at times it may call for you to look for partners who are not looking for you because they are so busy engaging the Great Commission in their context. They have a vision for their context and beyond. They really understand the call to the Great Commission, and they are engaging it from their context. And learning from indigenous models, because there's now indigenous models that have now been identified in some of these global countries. And so how do we join that versus come and bring in our Western models to them? One of the examples we tend to use in this is a lot of times the Western churches are still dictating to the global churches what I'd call a Saul's armor type of model. It's too heavy, it's not indigenous, it's not agile, it's not available to all, versus using what is indigenously within our context. If you read the story of David and Goliath, David just had to bend down to find 5 smooth rocks. But an armor was not ubiquitous then. Rocks were everywhere. Sometimes we've been given Saul's armor and it's too heavy. It's not for us. We cannot use it. So understanding partnerships and bringing people to partnerships and understanding what models work in their context in this day and age is a critical thing for a missions team or a missions committee at a local church. So that's one. The second one would be the idea of understanding that missions is for everyone. It's not for a few. It's not just for a committee. It's not just for a few people where some people pay and others go. But this is where everyone is involved in engaging of missions, is that the call for Ephesians 4:11, 12, and 13 is our work is to equip the saints for the works of service. And so everybody's called to be a missionary. How we live it out may be different, but the call of missions is for everyone. It's not for just a few. So as we engage partnerships around the world, and as we try to engage the entire church to be a part of a mission world, I think that will embrace some of the evolution of missions that is happening in our world today.
Well, this is going to raise some questions for missions committees who would like to do a good job of this. When a church is looking for finding global partners, I wonder whether you have advice for that, seeking out a global partner, how a Western church might go about doing that.
A while back, I took some time to write things that I've learned about finding partners, and we can attach that document to this podcast. But I mentioned one of them is finding for partners who are not looking for you. Another one would be partnership is not between one pastor of a church and one pastor of another local church. Partnership can be about relationships at multiple levels. Do the senior pastors know each other? Do the executive pastors know each other? Do the youth pastors know each other? In such a way that if one part was to be removed, the partnership would still remain. And then a commitment to long-term engagement, long-term sustained relationship. It's not a project-based relationship. So who we are informs what we do, not what we do informing who we are. So things like that really do help. There's no one-way giving. It's this giving and receiving. There's a mutuality and collective decision-making. Money does not lead the relationship, and then also, the posture of learning, again, as I said, is can we be open, especially in the global north, to us receiving missionaries instead of us just sending missionaries, is to allow missionaries to come and do missions at us because they have unique expressions that we can learn. So, for example, we had a music group, and our way of music is nothing like you find in the US. It's more communal, there's more dance, there's more engagement. So you can learn some aspects of worship from just engaging the African or the Latino church. We can learn about engaging Muslims in the Middle East through the churches in the Middle East. So there's ways and things that we can receive missionaries so that we can be able to learn from that. So those are some of the things what it would mean for a missions committee at a local church.
Well, some very helpful practical ideas there. And Christian mentioned that we will add some of these documents, one in particular that he mentioned, to the show notes. For those who are regular with us, we create show notes for each episode. So any resources that Christian mentions, we will include there. I'm also going to include there a few other references to podcast episodes in the past that are dealing with the value of networking and partnering around the world and the new role of the North American Church in global missions. So invite you to consider checking those out. In just a moment, Christian's going to share some more about implications of the evolution of missions and what it means for the local church. Just before we share that part of the conversation, we'd like to share with you this missions resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Did you know that billions of people still haven't heard the gospel? Send International is a global movement of Jesus followers making disciples among the unreached. We've helped hundreds of churches and mission workers engage the unreached with the life-changing message of Jesus. To explore how Send can help you engage the unreached, visit send.org today. And now, back to today's conversation.
We are back with Christian Mungai, the Global Engagement Pastor at Mariners Church in California. And that music you just heard is from his musical group, Milele. You can check them out on Spotify, Milele, M-I-L-E-L-E, which in Swahili means forever. We've been talking about some of the implications of the evolution of missions, including partnerships. Christian, what's another implication of this evolution?
Another implication of the evolution of missions is to look at global trends. And one of the global trends that we have to come face to face with is this idea of globalization, which is marked by immigration mostly. It means that there's someone from everywhere. There's someone from everywhere. You see, globalization is the process of integration arising from an interchange of worldview, products, ideas, people, and other aspects of culture. Our world is much more connected today than it was at the turn of the 19th century. So these shifts have happened between the 19th and the 20th centuries. They are indicated by transportation. You and I can get to any part of the world in 24 hours. There's telecommunications and infrastructure, which changes our world, and which then generates interdependence of economic and cultural activities. The IMF, a while back, identified 4 major globalization trends. The first one was trade and transactions. Second one was capital and investments. And then there's migration and movement of people. And then the dissemination of knowledge, which is, if you think about going viral. But I think the one that I'd like to hone in on is with regard to globalization is immigration, because it's a major implication to the evolution of mission. What I'd call it is diaspora engagement. Diaspora meaning the scattering of any people group from its original homeland and relocate it to another place and form a new community. So this is what we call diaspora engagement. Think about it from immigrants, refugees, international students, businessmen and businesswomen who are operate biculturally, and then intentional engagement of, global leaders into a different context. So that's an implication of the evolution of missions. How do we then engage missions? And this is one that I think we could change the trajectory of missions, because we no longer have to go very far to engage the global world. The global world is in our backyard. So what does it mean for us to do that? Do you know that since 1990, there's been 56 million people who've immigrated to the US alone? Out of the 56 million, only about 400,000 have been tracked to join the church.
We recently recorded an episode with Pastor Yao Purvey from Montreal, and he really informed us as far as how many international students alone. That's before we get to the marketplace where business people have come. Now, I'm a Canadian, and I was particularly interested in the Canadian figures. Over 600,000 international students in Canada. And, of course, more than double that in the United States.
In the US, about 1 million.
Yes, there are hundreds of thousands of international students. And also striking was the statistic he mentioned that, at least in Canada, approximately 70% of those 600,000 are from countries of the 1040 window that we would consider very challenging to reach. Anyway, I don't mean to go too far down that road, but as you talk about diaspora, the students have come here. There are marketplace people who have come here. And have we fully thought this through?
Yeah, that's the opportunity that we have, because most international students are the creme de la creme of any society. And so when they go back to their countries, they'll be operating at the higher echelons of society. They'll be the leaders. Most of them go back and lead multinationals. But the interesting thing, an interesting fact that we have here in the US is that 75% of international students, 75% of the 1 million international students in the US will never enter an American home. And what a missed opportunity for us in the West for not engaging that opportunity that is right in front of us. So those are trends that they can inform us on how to engage differently. I have seen where we've reached some international students where our church is right by a local university, which is now about 40% Chinese international students. And so in reaching out to the Chinese students here, they're going back. We recently saw a Chinese student get baptized, go back, and is now leading in a really good multinational company, but they've gone back with their faith. And they would not have known about, the gospel if it was not for our people engaging right across in their neighborhood. So that's a trend that we need to think about deeply and even engage this globalization, but especially the immigration, the diaspora engagement, refugees, international students, immigrants, businessmen and businesswomen. It could really inform our missions models for the future.
Just before we leave this, again, I want to ask, what does this mean for a missions committee in a local church?
I think the first thing is to do a demographic check in your church. I think for a missions committee, if you want to find out what's going on in the global world, just do a demographic check of your church and your city. It would be indicative of what you could do. So just a demographic check. The other one is understanding or finding out who are the international students in your area, and then figuring out who are the refugees, or is there a refugee hub in your city, in your area, because that will inform you on how to engage and the opportunities at hand. So I think the first one is just the idea of learning, and you learn from people who are from the 2/3 world who happen to be in your neighborhood. So find out who from Africa, from Latin America, or from Asia is within your congregation or within your city. That's an easy way to begin this conversation. And then after that, ask them, what is it that we could do to learn to see how we can engage the global world through reaching our own city?
Very good first steps, readily available to us. Well, as we wind down, Christian, I want to ask you about resources that you would recommend if churches would like to become more globally minded. What do you have to recommend to them?
I think the first one is one that most people know, and it's the one that kind of revolutionized this whole global engagement. It's the book, The Next Christendom by Philip Jenkins out of Baylor, because that one is able to descriptively give you an understanding of the numbers and what the shift is. And then as we get deeper into it is understanding toxic charity. And toxic charity kind of gives you how the West has, in the most part, while very well-intentioned, has addressed symptoms versus systemic issues. And how you diagnose a problem will determine how you treat it. So the book Toxic Charity by Robert Lupton kind of helps engage that. Alongside those would be books like When Helping Hurts by Brian Fickett. And then there's Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo, which I like because she's a Goldman Sachs professional who actually is from Zambia. So she calls it Dead Aid, and that's a resource that is wonderful. Another resource that has come out recently is actually by one of my friends, Dr. Wanjiru Gitao, who talks about my home church in Kenya, Nairobi Chapel and Mavuno Church, known as Mega Church Christianity. And this is how millennials in Kenya are engaging this whole idea from their perspective versus waiting for missionaries to come and do missions for them. Millennials are actually stepping into the front lines of changing their society by engaging a city that engages a country, then engages a continent, and then ultimately the world. So those are resources that you can use, that you can address.
Super. Thank you. We will include all of those in the show notes as we always do. Also, Pastor Christian, want to ask if any of our listeners would like to follow up with you, reach out with a question or something they'd like to unpack with you. How could they be in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, especially from a practical standpoint. We've been able to develop some very, very practical ways of being able to engage some of these conversations so that they're not just ethereal and at a high level, but they're more at a personal, very tactical way. So my email is cmungai@marinerschurch.org, or you could even call me on my line here at the office. It's 949-769-8265.
Well, thank you for your generosity to be open to that connection. We've had a lot to think about here, and I appreciate you mentioned that you've got practical resources too, but we did want to spend some time talking about how we think about these things so that we can think more as a globally minded church, and this conversation has been helpful. Thank you for taking this time with us today and for sharing with our audience.
Thank you very much, Max.
Wow, what an episode with some theory and some practical ideas about how we can be missions-minded, globally minded as churches. As we wrap up today, I'd like to mention a few other episodes that are related to topics mentioned today. Number 23 was the globalization of missions from everywhere to everywhere, which is something Christian mentioned today. Number 55, what's the role of the North American church in global mission? Paul Borthwick really explores what's the new posture of the North American church. And of course, Christian mentioned that today, a learning posture. And finally, episode 64, what's happening in missions today with Ted Esler as he talks about the globalization of missions. Those will all complement the discussion that we had today with Christian. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thank you for listening, and we invite you to join us in 2 weeks when we'll continue the conversation, exploring this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.